Curious about how the Indian state really works, its levers of power, tech ambitions, and geopolitical maneuvers, explore it all through one of three specializations in our 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. Applications close August 24th.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
What do you do when you have so many books you're meaning to read, but you never get around to them? Well, you decide to do a podcast on the books you want to read, and inevitably so, the day of reckoning arrives. In our case, the date we want to record the podcast, and we would have read the books we plan to discuss. Well, this is the smug assumption that prompted the idea for this episode, backed by self-knowledge and an urge to outsmart ourselves. We don't know if this is a good idea or a terrible one, but we'll soon find out. So stick around. I'm Shreya, your host for today, and I'm joined by my good colleagues Shobhankita and Arindam. Hi, folks.
Hi, Shreya.
Hi, Shreya. Hi, Shobhankita. Nice to be here.
So our plan for today is to discuss two books on policymaking in India. One I've read and one Shobhankita has read very recently that Arindam and I have read a little earlier. So we'll need to jog our memories a little bit. But without further ado, let's get started. I'll introduce the book I'm reading and its core argument in brief before we discuss the book and move on. So I read this book called South versus North by Neelakantan R.S. As the name suggests, in this book, the author begins by exploring the disparity and divergence between southern and northern Indian states on output metrics like health, education, and economy. A key reason for this growth is subnationalism. If I can bring some history from the book, this started in the late 19th century with Aikya Kerala, a political movement against the upper caste in the states of Travancore and Cochin for increased representation in jobs. This later became bigger, and going beyond jobs, it grew into a movement that forged an identity for the Malayali, bringing them closer at a time when Kerala did not have an identity, bringing focus to education and health. Much later, Tamil Nadu saw a similar movement by non-Brahmins against upper caste Brahmins for job representation. It also became a political anti-caste movement, solidifying the Tamil identity against Brahmins, and offshoots of this led to the Dravidian movement, further deepening the Tamil identity linguistically and culturally against New Delhi and Hindi opposition. Similarly, instances of subnationalism have taken place in Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and Telangana. This kinship is also reflected in the welfare policies in peninsular states, where public distribution schemes are more universal than targeted, which is what the union recommends, and is also seen in the Indo-Gangetic states where it's very targeted. But the bigger issue is that the book brings out is not just that the southern states are growing exponentially or have grown exponentially over other northern states. It's also about the poorer northern states growing more populous in the coming decades. So India's most populous cities are its least prosperous cities. And we'll come to why that's a problem for the union in a while. Again, if I can bring some history from the book here, India's policy efforts in the 1970s made population control a national priority to protect against the Malthusian trap, where Thomas Malthus, an 18th century English clerk, described a situation where any improvements in the availability of resources is a temporary phenomenon, and that once population catches up, the society's per capita indicators return to their original low levels. And in the years since, the states of Peninsular India have successfully brought down the total fertility rate, which is TFR, through educating girls and improving education metrics overall for women. And this has not been the case for states in the Indo-Gangetic plain, and these states have not been able to bring their TFR down. Currently, 35 to 45% of the population in these states is under the age of 15, as opposed to under 25 for all the southern states. So the northern states will only continue to be more populous for the next coming decades. And the data on population growth and divergence lead to a bigger problem for the Indian Union. The original provision in the Indian Constitution, as in most liberal democracies, was for seat allocation in Parliament to be appointed based on population, as reflected in the most recent census data. This exercise is foundational to the idea of a legitimate democracy, and it's also enabled by a periodic delimitation exercise. which recommends the number of seats each state will be given according to its population. Now, in 1976, the 42nd Amendment of the Indian Constitution froze the delimitation exercise on account of the population control drive the government had undertaken. The idea was that if one state implemented population control well and another didn't, the state that implemented it well will have fewer people in the future than the one that did not, and that would be unfair. And so this freeze has since continued. It's been kept in place longer, and it's now set to last till 2026. So the author brings us to this precipice with history on how states have grown and population in these states, and brings us to the central question of the book, which is what happens next. Will the southern states be punished with lesser representation for implementing a policy successfully? But if the freeze is extended for more years, it means lesser representation for the people of the Indo-Gangetic states, as their population is only increasing. But it's also not just about the future. Things are far from perfect. The book also talks about how actual transfers of tax revenue from the union to state have not changed much over the years, despite several finance commissions' recommendation on increasing the vertical devolution of states. Vertical devolution is basically how tax resources are split between the center and the state. Even as finance commissions mandates higher transfers, the union sort of slashes other untied discretionary transfers, maintaining the overall ratio of transfers, which defeats the whole purpose of these recommendations. And so I'll stop with that. Over the years, the union has made changes like increasing the share of cesses and surcharges as a percentage of gross tax collected. And that way, the tax collected does not make it to the divisible pool, which states can then get, leading to governance in states. So that's the core premise that the author brings. He talks about how things are, how things can be, and he also poses some solutions for how this can be improved. Sorry for the monologue, but I wanted to give some background on where this started. This was illuminating for me in that I didn't know about the history of these states and some of these political movements that have happened, or of the population drive that took place in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Thanks, Shreya. This is very interesting. I had a few questions as I was listening to you. Firstly, about subnationalism in the southern states, right? Is that the only reason for how the southern states have grown so much as compared to the northern states, according to the book? Or does the book also talk about any governance mechanisms that other states could learn from, specifically from the histories of the 4 and now 5 southern states? Is it also about, like you mentioned, the welfare mechanisms being more broader versus targeted? But is there also other things the book points to history-wise?
So historically, he does allude to different ideas of what people say this could be, but he attributes subnationalism as a main reason for why these states have developed a shared identity, a kinship for their people as a result of these political movements, spanning years. So that's also how he differentiates the identity these states have for themselves with other northern states. He talks about how the shared identity has led them to sort of invest in common public goods like education and health, and to sort of seek, public utilities for all as opposed to a zero-sum game. It's also in contrast to how these states were doing before these subnationalist movements, right? Like Kerala apparently was not even a state. It didn't even have an identity. The state of Travancore had elites and it had these other classes. There was no sense of unity between them. And it took this movement, this Aikya Kerala movement that came, and then it sort of became something much bigger, which then gave like this Malayali identity, which was brand new. And he sort of talks about this as like the genesis of that state. These movements, same with Tamil Nadu. The Tamil identity did not exist before subnationalist movements. Periyar came with his anti-caste movements, and all of these movements have prioritized education. So that's also a way for these states to, I think they've gotten so ahead in education and health metrics because of these early movements that they've seen bringing their identity together. This research point, which he shares on public distribution schemes, is true even today, where the outlook for southern states is more universal and broad-based, whereas the union recommends that you're more targeted, as is also seen in northern states, where it's more specific and more targeted. Yeah. He doesn't allude to any other reasons apart from subnationalism. I'm trying to recall. Yeah.
But does he say why is there a link between the subnationalism movements that have grown in these states and their policies on education, etc.? Right. So why is subnationalism the cause for these policies? I mean, what ties them on? Generally, you'll see this link missing between jingoistic nationalism and delivery of public goods, right? But in case of subnationalism in the southern states, it has worked. Why has that worked? Is there anything?
The policies on education, you mean?
Yeah, education, distribution, like the PDS systems, etc. Right. So all of that also. So is there any link between subnationalism and these policies working out well there?
Not really. It's he doesn't say that it's been success all throughout. He talks about subnationalism as setting the stage for the state to come together and putting education and health at the fore. He doesn't say that it's really a genesis story, not so much that everything since has worked out well. A lot of credit goes to midday plans, midday schemes and policies that the union has implemented. So it's not been completely up to this state, but they had like a fertile ground for these policies to take shape.
And what does the book then say in terms of policy recommendations that are more forward-looking? If this is where we are right now, where the delimitation exercise is sure to happen unless we kick it down even further, what then are the recommendations for a more just, even distribution between the states?
Yeah, so the book talks about ideas that are currently being discussed, which is more parliament seats. So suggestions include increasing the number of parliament seats there are, so there are more seats to go around. Another one is that you can increase new seats, but you also reduce their power, so then the southern states are also represented and you have more seats, like a win-win kind of a situation. But that's the same thing anyway. That's no improvement from what we already have. Yet another extreme solution really is to increase devolution all the way to the panchayat level. Thereby, if the issue is, the power that the union has, to sort of reduce it by increasing devolution to the panchayats. That way, it's not as much of a problem as it is right now. I also want to mention that our researchers also put out a couple of research papers on this topic, where Pranay Kudastani and Sarthak Pradhan's op-ed on this topic talk about how more than horizontal devolution of house between states, what we really need to be looking at is vertical devolution of increasing the state share as opposed to the center, which is often not spoken about. The common conversation is mostly around what states get as opposed to each other, which is why also we talk about diversity, we talk about population and all of that. Their core premise also includes that across the board states are getting less. And so increasing vertical devolution is key to attempting to solve this problem.
Right. Yeah, the cess and the surcharge is not in the divisible pool, so it doesn't go to the states.
Correct.
Yeah. So we need to reduce those at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Their op-ed talks about all of that. I will include that in the show notes. A couple of things that stood out for me was that this fiscal structure has been in place since the British Crown. So this is pre-independence times. And also in the 1860s, there was a cabinet mission plan that recommended that the states of British India have near complete sovereignty with a severely restricted union. So we have been here before. And apparently Muhammad Ali Jinnah saw this as a step short of partition and as a favorable option. But then the book says that Nehru wanted a stronger union to fight poverty. And Ambedkar also wanted a stronger union to make sure that elites don't take over local governments. And so this didn't happen, and we ended up having a stronger union after partition and in independent India. So those are pretty interesting for me to also read about.
Yeah, I think when we started with the structure right after independence, maybe that was the need of the hour, really, because the readers at that point felt that India would do well with a stronger union so that it could fight again or hold the country together. When we had divisive tendencies, but now probably we need to think more in terms of true federalism, right? And this ties in well with what Ajay and Kelkar in our next book that we're going to discuss also talked about when it came to GST, right? So we'll come to that later on, but there also they've talked about, devolving more of the taxes directly to the local self-governments, yeah.
But, it's also not like fiscal imbalances don't exist in other countries, right? West Germany is more prosperous than East Germany. Southern states in the US are poorer than like the industrialized North. And so tax transfers happen as a solution for this sort of divergence, right? But India's case is different in that we are a lot more diverse than a lot of these other countries. And states themselves hold a lot of diversity within them. And there's a lot of contrast that brings. And second, and most importantly, our most prosperous states are not our most populous states, which is what you'll see in most countries where migration takes people from less prosperous states to more prosperous states. And so then allocation also becomes easier in that sense. In India, we have this issue where our poorer states have a higher population growth because of uncontrolled TFR. And TFR is a cause for population, not migration. So this is a double challenge for us to solve in terms of, how our states are and how to optimally allocate resources and power, really. I found that also very interesting to contrast how things are in India versus other countries.
Anything in the book that you didn't agree with, or like the readers to, read with a pinch of salt?
So one thing I want to read more is just about the union's power, right, in states functioning. This was something that I want to read more about, in that the book also in later chapters talked about how the union sets arbitrary rules, then all these random cesses. It also gets to set limits on fiscal budgets, fiscal deficits in state budgets, whereas it doesn't really follow the sort of limit in its own budget. Apparently, it also advises state governments on fiscal prudence, which also doesn't apply to itself. It doesn't need to be prudent when it comes to making decisions. It also gets to set policies that states must cooperate in, which states do not have a say in bringing into place in the first place. So I want to read a little bit more about how this plays out, across states, across indicators. And I also want to, while the book talks about the Finance Commission's recommendations and how over the years, even though it has been recommending it for quite many years, the overall share hasn't changed. So there's some bucket that keeps coming up where tax revenue goes, and then that's not part of the divisible pool. So I also want to read more about what are some of these changes that have come over the years, what new buckets have come where the sort of divisible pool goes into, and then states don't get them in the end. So yeah, I don't have any disagreements as much as more sort of rabbit holes to read about, really.
Yeah, you mentioned those the principles that the center tries to enforce on the states, right? So, as part of the Finance Commission devolution formula, also it uses parameters like fiscal prudence and those sorts of parameters to decide what would be the share of each state, right? So, some state is good to impose that fiscal structure or responsibility on states, but some also call it patronizing. So, yeah, that's a tough call to take. Yeah.
I understand. I think we should move on. I just have one final TIL, like a thing I learned that I found very amusing, which is that, I mentioned that the fiscal structure of the Indian Union was there from the British Crown times, right? And apparently there was a British governor of the Madras presidency, Sir Charles Trevelyan is his name. He raised objections on the taxation proposal, arguing that there needs to be a principle of representation in taxation. And this came very uncomfortably close to questioning the place of the British rule even in India, in that he was asking, why should I pay for taxes that when there's, something else happening somewhere, like there is no representation. And it was almost like questioning what is the British doing here even. And so he was then transferred somewhere else. But he was one of the first people to actually question the sort of disproportionate taxation for territories in British India. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's move on to Shobhankita's book. Shobhankita, if you can offer an introduction and core thesis of your book.
Yeah. So this is In Service of the Republic by Ajay Shah and Vijay Kelkar, which honestly is a foundational book in economic policy and reasoning. And I should have read this a long, long time ago. But I'm glad for this project that I'm at least picked it up and got through it. And I realized many of the things that the book touches upon were actually covered in the GCPP foundational course. So it was sort of overlap. So that was a good thing that the concepts were not completely new to me. But regardless, I think Some of the big takeaways from the book is firstly that a state is a coercive being. I think we tend to look at a state as this paternalistic policymaker that acts in your best interests, but that's clearly not true because the state, by definition, has a monopoly on violence. And anything that the state gets you to do, it does that with the threat of violence. And non-compliance can then be punished, right? So the state aggregates to itself this monopoly in violence, and the state then uses this threat of violence to change behavior and collect taxes, which it then sort of reallocates, and different budgetary measures are then sort of taken care of. So I think that's the first takeaway, that we must be very skeptical about anything that the state does, because by definition it's coercive. And the big idea about liberal democracies then is about checks and balances on the state, so that there is accountability, so that the violence of the state can be channeled in a way that's controllable, predictable, and also in a way that's just. Because everything about the social contract, where individuals agree to give up some personal freedoms in exchange for security and benefits from the state, otherwise then kind of completely falls apart, right? So I think that's the foundational lesson to begin with. The book also talks about, for example, when does intent as opposed to implementation, as opposed to policy design, when does that matter? Because many times we as citizens can tend to pass off policies because the idea or the intention behind the policy may have been good, or that might have been the rhetoric that was used by policymakers to pass a law. But do we really look at necessarily the design and the implementation of some of these laws and policies? Maybe not, right? So intent doesn't matter as much as design and implementation. So just being able to separate the two also kind of helps in just being able to then have our policymakers accountable. I think the other thing that the book really drove home was the idea of market failures, which again we sort of cover in our foundational courses. But really this idea that because a state is a coercive being, and by definition it enforces things in a top-down manner, the best way to organize a complex adaptive system that a society is to let it, people and companies and organizations, in a very self-organizing way, do their own thing, right? So this idea that it's not enforcement as much as collective action, that's individual choice and really free market forces that can enable change. And so the idea of market failure is that there are situations where a free market left to its own devices fails to allocate resources efficiently or bring about outcomes that are efficient for everybody. So the idea of a market failure is that when such a thing happens, that when free market doesn't necessarily solve what's needed for an efficient allocation and outcomes, that's when the state must intervene, right? So first question is, what should the government do? The first question to ask in that is there a market failure? Right? If there is no market failure, it's best to let private players sort of take it upon themselves. It's not for the state to intervene. And the book, of course, goes into much detail about what these market failures can be. For example, one could be an externality wherein there are two transacting parties, but there is a cost or a benefit that's imposed on people who are not the two transacting parties. So is there a third party cost or benefit? Then, such a case involves either a positive or a negative externality. That could be one example of market failure. The second might be when something is a public good, when something is non-rivalrous as well as non-excludable, because then there is no private incentive for somebody to come in and provide such a good, then the state must do it, right? So, for example, health, education sort of fall into this category in some sense. The other is market control. You don't want concentration of power or too much power in a few forces, in a few companies, in a few hands. So, if there is potential for such concentration of power, again, it makes sense for the state to intervene. And the last is when there is information failure, where access to information between two transacting parties is not even, then it makes sense again for the state to intervene to make it a fair marketplace. So these are the four market failures: externalities, public goods, market control, and concentration of power, and information asymmetry. So in such a case, it makes sense for the state to intervene, and the state can intervene broadly in three ways. One is the state can provide a certain service completely, like how we have public schools at this point in time, or it could be that the state just regulates and lets private players sort of do their own thing. So the state plays the role of an umpire. And the third could be that the state finances, but private players take it upon themselves to implement and design. So there could be different ways that the state could intervene. But the first question to ask, because the state is a coercive entity, is does state intervention even make sense? And if so, why? Which kind of market failure? And if so, then what kind of implementation to then go ahead with? I thought that was interesting. And the book, of course, lays out several case studies in the Indian context to demonstrate examples of successes and failures across the country, which we can go through. But I think the other interesting thing that the book also talks about is the undersupply of criticism as a problem, where the book essentially says that we need to be able to hold our policymakers accountable. And if we don't have enough criticism going around, then that again is a market failure. Dissent is important in any democracy, especially in a liberal democracy, holding your policymakers accountable. So the shortage of that is not good, and hence criticism and dissent is a good thing. And that's, again, something that the book talks about. But being able to frame the lack of criticism itself as a market failure was interesting, because that's all the book is about. And just the lack of data in the Indian context, because it talks about how economists can sometimes be doctors without a stethoscope, because they don't necessarily have the data and the tools to then go devise policy or even assess whether a policy that has been implemented has been a reasonable success or a failure, etc. We don't have sufficient data, and hence we're most economists and most folks who study public administration, public policy, are sometimes just sort of headless chicken, because they're sort of not able to piece together the intent, the design, the implementation, the outcome, as well as what was initially projected of it, because that loop sort of never completes, right? So I think these were some sort of high-level takeaways. But I'm happy to have you sort of chime in with any of your comments and takeaways from the book as well. Arindam, anything?
Yeah. Apart from what all you have mentioned, I liked their emphasis on that 7-stage policy pipeline also, right? So they, it has some pretty intuitive steps also, but some which, we probably miss out in the political sphere, right? So the first stage being diagnosing the problem. So as you rightly mentioned, finding out the finding out if there's a market failure, etc., right? And then if there's a market failure, what sort of step do you take? Out of the three that you mentioned, production, regulation, and financing, which one to take, right? So that's diagnosing the problem, coming up with solutions, options, etc. But the second point that they mention is about consultation with stakeholders and critics, right? And this step is pretty important if you want to be able to design a solution that really fits the problem, is least intrusive, is the least harmful, etc. Right? It also helps you become aware of what sort of unintended consequences it could have, what side effects it could have. Then the fifth point that they mention is about assessing the state capacity to implement that solution. Now that's pretty important if you want the policy to succeed, right? So quite often we hear people say the policy was good, but it was not implemented well. But as we say at Takshashila, a policy that can't be implemented well is not really a good policy, right? So thinking about the state capacity to implement the solution is also important. And if you want to do that well, you need to have proper feedback mechanisms. And that's where, all the transparency that you just mentioned in their examples on the financial sector, they have put a lot of emphasis on, putting out the data in the public sphere, data like on the condition of the financial systems of the banks, etc., right? So that under public scrutiny, you can, unearth problems before they become huge problems, right? So that sort of feedback mechanism helps. That sort of ongoing evaluation helps to, course correct and do an iterative revision. So, so that was one important nice thing that I found in the book. There was one more point where they talked about the 4 matrices that can be used to understand or analyze government intervention or to understand the complexity in government, right? And for this, they have borrowed from, they have expanded on the ideas of Land Pritchett. I think 3 points were taken from Land Pritchett, and I guess Ajay Shah and Vivek added the 4th point. So the points are pretty interesting. The first point is whenever you want to, for example, want to decide on what sort of action a government needs to take and what sort of problem it wants to solve, first question you ask is the transaction intensive? Is that thing transaction intensive, right? So you ask whether that governmental intervention will involve a large number of individual transactions or interactions, because when the transactions involved are too many. There's a complexity in managing and monitoring these transactions, right? So that complexity increases exponentially, and that then leads to more errors, delays, corruption, right? So when you want to decide between, say, two problems to solve, and you see that there's a problem that's going to be very transaction intensive to solve, then the kind of structures that you would have to, but say that problem is a priority problem to solve, then the structures that you need to make sure that errors and delays don't crop up will be somewhat different. The next point that you need to consider is whether government employees have discretion, right? So what's the degree of judgment or choice that government officials exercise in processing those transactions, right? Higher discretion would mean officials can make subjective decisions, and that then could lead to rent seeking, bribery, favoritism, etc., right? So functions which have low discretion, where rules and procedures are like highly specified, are highly discrete, etc., right? Then those are easier to monitor. Next point that you can consider is what are the stakes of the transaction, right? What could be what is the importance or the potential consequence of each such transaction? High stakes transaction would have serious legal consequences, huge amounts, etc. involved, right? So then you have to be really careful there. And then obviously the point that they belabor throughout the book is about opacity, right? So what's the sort of opacity involved in the transaction, how transparent or observable that transaction would be to external parties. And the external parties could include citizens, auditors, oversight bodies, etc., right? So if it is difficult for outsiders to verify, then that's something that you need to be extra careful of. So looking at these 4 points really helps in analyzing what sort of government intervention you want to go for.
Yeah, I think state capacity and the lack of it is a big one in the book, right? They talk about different constraints that the state has. For example, first is information. Because of lack of data, there is just the lack of information. Secondly, the lack of knowledge. Maybe you don't have intellectual thinkers or people to think about these things in a way that is sound economic reasoning, right? And the third then becomes resource and administrative in terms of constraint, because do you really have the policemen, the law enforcement agencies, all of that to be able to really go do this without necessarily extracting and taking away the freedom from individual players. And of course, then also voter rationality, which is, do your citizens know enough about public policy to then hold you accountable sufficiently, right? So there are multiple constraints that any policy is either designed, implemented, or even the intent of it and the implementation of it, right? Like all of this operates under constraints. The other thing that I thought was very interesting in the book is just the marginal cost of public funds, right? It's very easy for us to think that 1 rupee spent by the state is 1 rupee spent by the state, but actually it's not, because the opportunity cost of that 1 rupee spent by the state and the leakages in the system, et cetera, means that it's actually a lot more from public funds that's taken away for that 1 rupee to be spent, right? So it is an inefficient system. The targeting to the final individuals that it intends to be targeted to is always never completely efficient. And just the opportunity cost that the state could then be, enforcing or implementing into means that there is always a cost to public funds, and we must be very, very careful when it comes to public finance.
I also like the idea of how they talk about competition and the idea of a sick company and how that's a welcome. It's really welcome in that it brings greater destruction, and a company dying is a good thing. I really liked that this perspective was brought as opposed to how we, generally think about companies dying in that sort of wasted potential. And this is basically realigning resources more efficiently in the market. And he also talks about how more competition is good and the need for robust bankruptcy laws to make sure companies can have this process of creative destruction more effectively. That was pretty interesting for me. Yeah.
And they talk about, having this, even in case of banks, right? Generally, we think of banks as institutions that need to be preserved. It's people's money. You don't want, banks to close and all of that, right? But bankruptcy applied to even financial institutions is something that they do talk about. So in their financial sector reforms, one of the case studies that they have taken is financial sector, etc., right? So there they do talk about having proper forbearance procedures, right? Sorry, not to have forbearance, and then have proper audits, proper scrutiny, and then if required, go for bankruptcy even for financial institutions. So that's something that's really interesting. Otherwise, we generally think of banks as something that you have to bail out.
Folks, I think we're running out of time now and we should close. But I, for one, am really glad that we got to discuss these two books and talk about these ideas. And I feel like we've also finished these books, which was our original goal as well. Thank you so much for joining this episode. It was so much fun to record and discuss these ideas with you guys. Hope to do it again next time.
Thank you. Thank you, Shreya. And just for our listeners, I also want to leave them with really sort of another foundational book in public finance, which is Studies in Indian Public Finance by Govind Rao, which I'm told is a must read for anybody who wants to understand economic reasoning, public finance, and concepts related to this in the Indian context. So maybe that's another book for us to check out post this podcast.
Yeah. Thanks, Shobs.
Thank you. Thanks, Shreya. Looking forward to reading the book that you talked about. I haven't read it. So yeah, maybe that's on my list now. Yeah.
Thanks, folks, for listening in. See you next time.
See you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.